Hey guys, Assalamu alaikum. So far in our conceptual videos, we have studied about what an asset is, what is an intangible asset, and how do we recognize an initially a separately acquired intangible asset. So in this video, we are trying to go over that all over again, and we are trying to understand it better, and we'll try to retain what we have learned and go a little bit deeper. And then eventually, we'll do certain questions to actually better understand the application of all the concepts. So, first of all, what exactly is an intangible asset? And an intangible asset has four characteristics. It's a simple one line definition, and the four characteristics it has is firstly, it has to be identifiable, and it has to be non monetary, and it has to be an asset, which means it should also meet the definition of an asset. Excuse me. And it has to be without physical substance. It goes without saying. So what exactly are these things, or these qualities that we are trying to better understand? And like our conceptual video, we'll go in the reverse order. Firstly, what is without physical substance? Now, there are two things, two aspects of this. One is the form, and an asset might have a physical form, but still not have a physical substance. So these are two different things. People confuse between the two. If I can touch something, it can still be an intangible asset because it has a physical substance. And this is not what a standard is talking about. The standard is talking about the substance. So we talked about the three examples. An asset could be a software which is entirely in its form and its substance intangible. But there could be a prototype which may have a physical substance. For example, there might be a sample of a product, and that sample might be the first ever invented sample. So that sample might have embodied within itself the knowledge and the design of that technology, and because of that, it might have a lot of worth. So the worth is not in the physical form, but is in the intangible aspect of the asset. So that is why that kind of prototype would also be an intangible asset. Now we also talked about an asset. So let's talk about it a little bit again, and let's zoom in a little bit. What is an asset really? So an asset is a resource controlled by an entity as a result of past events, and from which future economic benefits are expected to flow to the entity, right? So just write down controlled by an entity as a result of past events. And from which future economic benefits are expected to flow to the entity. Okay, but before I go further into this, I would tell you a story about something. A story about a man's discovery of the skies and the earth and the solar system and the understanding of that. Uh, Initially, humans used to think of Earth as flat. Then people started thinking about it as it's round. But they still used to believe that the Earth is the center of the solar system. Then eventually, as science learned more things about the solar system, they realized that sun is the center of the universe, and things go on. So first we knew something about an asset, and we thought an asset is a property, plant, equipment, or an inventory, right? That was our first model of what an asset really is, right? It could be PPE, or it could be an inventory. But then we also talked about of an asset as a storage of expenditure, right? And then we thought of an asset as a promise for future economic benefits. So what exactly is an asset among all of these things? And how can we correlate our concepts of what an asset is with what the definition is saying? So we stress too much on expenditure, but the word expenditure is not there in the definition, right? So what is there in the definition? The definition talks about past events, right? And that past event could be either an expenditure, it could be a government grant, anyone paying something to you for free, and then it could be perhaps changes in economic circumstances or changes in the market which could have resulted in revaluation. And all of these changes should have resulted in a resource, right? And that resource might have ended up promising us future economic benefits. Right? Now, in addition to this, we should also have a control over that resource. So if we incurred an expenditure and it resulted in a resource, and that resource was with a promise, with the expectation of future economic benefits, then we have an asset. So this is our, so far, the most comprehensive understanding of what an asset really is. And we discussed too much about the asset because we wanted to also understand why are we talking about an intangible asset and why are we actually recognizing it. Because an intangible asset can be simply a concept like a skill of staff, like what people think about your business. For example, your brand is what people think about you, right? Brand is not a logo. Logo is a separate intangible asset, but brand is what people think about your business or your product. And that is something very abstract. Similarly, an intangible asset can be a permission that a government has granted to someone. For example, if an aeroplane company has been granted a permission to fly over certain routes, then that is just a permission. And that permission has some worth because that permission would let that company earn something in the future years. So it's all about the promise of future economic benefits by either a government grant or by expenditure or by revaluation or changes in economic circumstances. Okay, so we were at non-monetary, right? So what is a non-monetary expense? You also need to zoom in a bit to get into this. Non-monetary is something that is not monetary. And what is a monetary asset? Monetary asset is either money. A monetary asset is either money, excuse me, or any contract or instrument that is convertible into fixed or determinable amounts of money. Now, what is fixed? For example, if 100,000 is 100,000 no matter what. And determinable is something that can be computed on the basis of something like an interest, which can be computed on the percentage of the notional amount. And that's a monetary asset. So an intangible asset does not include a monetary asset, it should be non-monetary. And the first characteristic an intangible asset should have is slightly more tricky. And that is, it should be identifiable, right? So let's talk about the identifiability. Well, to be identifiable, an asset either has to be separable or it has to be arising from contractual rights. And what does this limitation really mean? Well, there are certain things that are too abstract that you cannot separately sell those things. For example, what if you have a business and you are running that business for 150 years, and because of 150 years of running, you might have an experience, right? And that experience might help you in earning better than other companies or performing better than other companies. Think of Ferrari. There's a sports car company. It's a very, very long history. And that is why it can produce engines and cars that a newly developed country cannot, a newly developed company cannot produce. So that experience is something that is giving it an edge, and that is also probably some sort of asset, right? But because Ferrari cannot separately sell that 150 years experience or separately rent that experience because it's not as concrete of a separable thing, it cannot also recognize that experience as an intangible asset. Why? Because this kind of asset is mixed with goodwill, and in fact these are the kind of things that form part of goodwill. Right? Now think of a license of an agreement provided by, is the link really not working? Okay guys, just bear with it, and you would inshallah eventually get a record if some of the parts are missing right now. Don't worry about that. I'll fix it in the next time inshallah. From contractual, okay, I was talking about if an entity has been provided with an air routes, if an airplane company has been provided with the air routes by the government, and the government also placed the condition in the contract that you cannot separately rent that license. Although that license is not separable, but it is arising from a contract, and that is why it is considered to be identifiable. So for an asset to be identifiable, it has either to be separable or it has to be arising from a contract. And if any of those two conditions is met, then that asset fulfills the criteria of being separable. Now let's talk about the other aspects of recognition criteria. So the recognition criteria is all about fulfilling the definition of an asset and fulfilling the definition of an intangible asset and a few more things, right? So let's get into this. Yeah. So first part of the recognition criteria is that it should meet the definition of an intangible asset. And the second part is that it should its cost should be measurable reliably. And future economic benefits should be to flow to the entity. Right? Okay, so how would you know that future economic benefits are probable or not? How would you know that future economic benefits are more than 50% or not? Well, obviously, no one has seen the future, but there are certain bases of these kind of analysis. So, although you don't need to really, this is not probably an examinable concept, but I'll just explain in 1 or 2 minutes so that you can get an idea of what standard wants an accountant to understand about this. First of all, this understanding of whether the future economic benefits are probable should be based on certain assumptions, right? And these assumptions should be, supportable and reasonable. Right? So these are the two qualities that they should have. And these assumptions should represent management's best estimate. And about what? About conditions that would prevail, the economic conditions. Okay. This estimate should be about the economic conditions and over the life of the asset, over the entire life of the asset. Which means if an asset has an expected life of 10 years, management should try to estimate what the economic conditions would be in each of those 10 years and should not even just expect whether future economic benefits are probable or not only based on the current economic conditions. It should really try to estimate what the future economic conditions would be. And that is the probability part of the recognition criteria. Now that we have some understanding of what the recognition criteria is, let's just discuss in a good uh, amount of depth. Now let's do certain questions and try to understand whether we understand the definition and the recognition criteria or not. Okay, so let's talk about the definition first. So the first question is, Mr. Asim has recently opened a luxurious restaurant named Delicious Dine. He paid a freelancer rupees 10,000 rupees to create a logo for his restaurant. Is the logo an intangible asset? Okay. Logo is a design, simply a two-dimensional or three-dimensional design that was printed on pieces of receipts or on the banners, all sort of marketing material. And this logo is normally used for several years, and its substance is not, its value is not in the design, but in the abstract aspect of it, which is not just a paper, but also the design embodied in it, right? So because the amount paid for it has to do with the intangible asset, it should be recognized as an intangible asset. So our answer is yes. This should be capitalized. Okay. Second our question is, Drastic Limited has started a bus company and obtained exclusive permission to drive buses on 3 routes across the city, which means these are the bus routes. And because it's an exclusive permission, only that bus company can drive the buses on that route. So is this permission an intangible asset? Well, yes, it is, because this would help it, enable it to earn the economic benefits over the life of the asset, right? The third question. Is goodwill an intangible asset as defined in IS 38? Well, goodwill is intangible and is an asset, but goodwill is not within the definition of intangible asset in IS 38, right? And why it is? Because it is not, which of the criteria it doesn't meet? Is it identifiable? Is it non-monetary? Is it asset? Is it without physical substance? Well, it is without physical substance, and it is an asset, and it is non-monetary, but it is not identifiable, right? So goodwill is not an intangible asset. The fourth one is, a financial analysis firm spent 240,000 rupees to train its 3 best financial analysts in Python programming language, which means that a firm is spending money to train its own staff to increase their skills. This would enable the firm to offer their services to international clients. The training was provided conditional to a restrictive contract, which means they are placing conditions on this contract, and the contract requires that employees who opt for the free training cannot leave the firm before expiry of 3 years, which means they are providing a training, but if an employee has to opt for that training, they have to bond themselves for 3 years to be used by the company. So is this extra skill an intangible asset? Well, in this context, yes, it is, because that extra money, that extra increase in the skills would enable the firm to enhance its earning capabilities, and in this case, this is also under control of the entity. Entity also has a control over the assets. Okay, next we have a well, okay, a well-reputed animation company created a 12-episode cartoon series to be released in the next year. Is this cartoon series an intangible asset? Well, all the cartoons you look at TV and all the series, all the seasons, all the dramas, all the movies, well, they're all intangible assets. Why? Because they are just recorded in something and they do not have a physical substance, right? So that is our basic understanding of what an intangible asset is. Now let's do a few questions on the recognition criteria, right? Okay. Uh, Consumer Services Limited has instructed his sales team to build a list of his customers and their email addresses so that he can inform them of new offers. So it's a firm that provides services, and this firm has told his sales team to build a list of customers and their email addresses. Now, this list would enable them to inform their customers of their new offers, right? If this list builds up, it may increase his sales. So, is that email list an intangible asset? And should this asset be recognized? Why or why not? Okay. An email list would enable it to market its products more effectively to its customers, and it might actually increase its sales. This is called part of a sales funnel, right? So this is some sort of asset, or some sort of resource, and it is some sort of asset. But should it be recognized? The question is, should it be recognized or not? And if not, which of the recognition criteria it does not fulfill? Well, is it identifiable? Well, arguably it is, because customer list can be sold to some other party. Is it non-monetary? Yes, it is non-monetary. Does it fulfill the definition of an asset? It is controlled by the entity. Yes. Would it result in future economic benefits? Yes, it will. And obviously, it is without physical substance. Even future economic benefits are likely to be probable if that firm knows how much would it be able to earn by the help of that customer list. But the cost should be measurable reliably, right? So in this case, whenever a customer list is created, it employs some current staff to collect the data from the customers, and it's really difficult to segregate the costs incurred on preparing the customer list from costs incurred on generally running the business or costs incurred on promotional activities. So that is why, as we'll learn later on, that customer lists cannot, internally generated customer lists cannot be recognized because the cost is not measurable reliably, right? So that should clarify certain things for you guys. And the next question is, this is just a version of the previous question, and that is the same training question. A financial analysis firm spent $240,000 to train its 3 best financial analysts in Python programming. This would enable them to offer their services to international clients, no condition attached. Should this asset be recognized? Why or why not? See, previously we had certain conditions attached, and those conditions resulted in control of that asset with the entity. But now they have trained their staff and they have incurred their expenditure, but they have no control over their employees because they can leave whenever they want. In that case, because there is no control, it does not meet the definition of an asset, and therefore it should not be recognized. If you look at the definition of an asset, it should be a resource that results from a source that should be controlled by the entity as a result of past events and from which future economic benefits are expected to flow. So a resource that is not controlled by the company, by the entity, cannot be recognized as an intangible asset, right? Okay. And the next we have the next is an interesting one. ABC Hospital in Wakanda purchased a software to provide its outpatient department facilities to patients online. There's a hospital which purchased a software, and using that software, it wants to provide OPD facilities online. The purchase price was 600,000 rupees, but an hour after the purchase, the hospital's legal advisor told the management that provision of online medical facilities is illegal in the country, which means in that country, in that fictional country, online medical services are illegal to provide. But now that it has purchased the asset, should it recognize it or not? If not, which conditions are not fulfilled? Well, this time, this is the probability of future economic benefits. If that something has been made illegal, which means that asset cannot generate future economic benefits, which means future economic benefits are neither expected nor probable, and in that case, it should not be recognized. Right? So far, so good. Let me see if there are some questions right here in the chat. Well, not yet. Thank you for liking the videos. Okay, so let's talk about the next aspect of our discussion, and that is how to compute, how to capitalize the separately acquired intangible asset. And as we talked about in the previous videos, that a separately acquired intangible asset is one where we outright purchase it, we pay a price to purchase it, and because of that reason, we do not have to worry about whether the cost is measurable reliably, because we are paying a price, and in that case, it is measurable reliably. And in that case, we also don't worry about whether future economic benefits are probable to flow to the entity. Why? Because we are paying the price, it should be considered that the price is being paid because future economic benefits were probable. Now remember the example we just did. The hospital did not recognize a software which it separately acquired, and the reason was probability, right? So, because we are supposed to presume that the future economic benefits would flow to the entity if it's purchased outright. But that presumption can be challenged by the circumstances. And in the previous example, this was exactly the case. We presume that future economic benefits are probable to flow to the entity whenever there is an outright purchase of an asset, wherever there is a separate acquisition. But if circumstances tell you that no, there are no more economic benefits that are likely to flow to the entity, in that case we cannot recognize that asset, right? So remember, cost should be measurable reliably, and future economic benefits should be probable to flow to the entity. These conditions are not skipped. These conditions are presumed to be true whenever we are acquiring that intangible asset separately, right? Okay. Now the question is, what should be included in the cost of that asset when we first acquire it, right? So cost of separately acquired intangible asset. Okay, firstly, it should contain the purchase price, which means the amount at which we have purchased the asset. And this should include all the non-refundable duties and taxes. And this should not include the trade discounts and rebates. Obviously, it's a common sense. Whenever you receive a trade discount, you do not add this to the purchase price, you simply reduce that. For example, if the purchase price was 100 rupees and the trade discount was 20 rupees, you would only recognize 80 as the purchase price. So that's common sense. We learned earlier. Now, in addition to the purchase price, we also have to add some directly attributable expenses. What are these directly attributable expenses? They could include the employee's salary for implementing that asset, and they could also include other employee benefits. And then they can include professional fees that is paid to some expert. And that will also include the cost of testing whether that asset is functioning properly. Okay. Now, as we discussed in the video, we should also know what not to include. And what not to include are things that are either happening after we have brought the asset to the current condition, to the condition intended to be used. So these assets, these expenses are to bring the asset to the condition intended to be used by the management. right? So we purchase an asset and we want to bring that to the condition we want to use it. But anything that happens after it has been brought to the condition, expenses on those aspects cannot be capitalized as part of the cost of the intangible asset. Uh, and similarly, then there are assets that are not directly attributable to that asset, and they can also not be capitalized. So expenses that are not directly attributable are okay. Uh, Cost of introducing a new product. For example, you purchase a brand from a company and you still have to develop the product and launch it. So you purchase a brand for, say, 10 million rupees, and then you have to launch a product, which might be a garment or t-shirt. And in launching that, you might have to incur some additional expenses, which include marketing and promotions. And those expenses cannot be capitalized as part of the brand, right? You cannot just do it just to inflate your assets. So, because that is not directly attributable to bringing, because a company can argue that I purchased a brand, but I'm enhancing that brand to bring it to the condition where I want to use it. But there's a false argument, and the standard setters, they say that this cannot be used. Cost of introducing a new product cannot be added to any purchased intangible asset. Uh, Similarly, if cost of relocating the business, for example, if there was a school in particular locality and the owners want to shut it off, they can transfer their current students to a new school, and against that transfer they may purchase, they may receive amount from that school, and so that is something that could be done. If the school paying that amount is actually kind of purchasing the customer loyalty, in that case there is an intangible asset. But because for that new school to be developed, they might have to also incur additional expenses to relocate their school. They cannot add those expenses into the intangible asset that they've just purchased. Okay. Similarly, uh, there are administrative and general expenses, and administrative and general expenses are just all over the place. They happen at all the time, and because they are general, they help the business to function properly, and no portion of that should be allocated to an intangible asset, because that is not directly attributable to bringing the asset to the condition intended for use by the management. Now, what happens after it is brought to the condition? Well, once it has been brought to the condition required by the management, there might be initial operating losses. Now these losses, for example, if an intangible asset is a software that is designed to run a production plant, and that production plant initially uh, produces a product, and that product does not sell very well. In that case, the losses that occur from initially operating that plant, that intangible asset that is driving that plant, cannot be capitalized as part of the asset. It's important to understand the connection between the two. They are close, they can be misunderstood as each other. If the same software was purchased and management was trying to test whether that asset is functioning properly or not, and during that test, if some defective pieces might have been created, then those pieces would have to be sold at a lower price. So that is part of the cost of testing. But after it has been prepared, after the asset is in the condition required by the management, initial operating losses cannot be capitalized as part of the asset, right? Similarly, if after it has been brought to the condition, management wants some additional changes to the asset, the cost of those additional changes after it has been brought to the condition required by the management cannot be capitalized. So that is a part of the cost that should be attributable. And similarly, if there was some finance component in the Okay, now we'll talk about the finance component. What is the finance component and what we should do about that? For example, if an entity purchases an asset for 100,000 rupees and it is supposed to pay to that customer 2 years later, the company is receiving the asset today and paying 100,000 rupees 2 years later. What does this mean? Well, effectively, it means that the company that is receiving that asset is actually taking the loan from the seller. How? If it had to pay rupees 100,000 today, which means it had to pay it itself, but if it doesn't have the money itself, it will have to take a loan from a bank to be able to pay to the seller. But the seller said, no, you don't need to go to the bank. You can pay me 2 years later, but at a higher price, which means that the seller would charge interest on the deferred payment. For example, if the interest that the seller wanted to charge the buyer was 10%, we have to present value this 100,000 rupees so that, okay, this is year 0, this is year 1, and this is year 2. And if we are present valuing the 100K, it has to be brought 2 years to present, which would make it 100,000 divided by 1 plus 10% is to the power 2. So that would be the actual value of the asset, and this difference would be the expense, the interest cost. So interest cost should be excluded from the from capitalization and should be expensed out in the year in which it is incurred, right? So whatever this is, you can compute this. Now let's work out the Now let's do an example on separately acquired intangible assets cost, right? And we'll do examples from your textbook so that it's a simple one so that you may get an idea of how we separately acquire, how do we compute the cost of separately acquired intangible assets. Okay. Okay, let me just copy and paste the question from your book. Okay, a theater limited acquires new technology that will significantly reduce its energy cost for manufacturing, which means it is some new technology and which will benefit it by reducing its cost in the future periods. So the costs incurred include cost of the new technology, trade discount, cost of the new technology, which is 1,500,000, trade discount provided, which is 200,000, training course for staff in new technology, that is 70,000, initial testing of new technology, 20,000, losses incurred while other parts of the plant shut down during testing and training, 30,000. All right, so the cost of the new technology, this is the purchase price of the asset, right? So should it be recognized? Yes, it should be. Trade discount, it has to be subtracted from the cost, right? Training course for staff in the new technology. Is this training course necessary to bring the asset to the condition where it is intended to be used? Well, no. This has nothing to do with the directly attributable cost which have to be incurred to bring the asset to the condition where it has to be used, intended to be used by the management. Initial testing. Initial testing is allowed to be capitalized, right? Because it is important to bring the asset to the condition, to calibrate the asset to bring it to the condition where it is intended to be used by the management. Losses incurred while other parts of the plant shut down during test and training. See, these are the other parts of the plant that are being shut down during tests and the training, which means it is not associated, it's directly attributable to bringing the asset to the condition where it is intended to be used. So this should not be included, right? So it's simple, 1,500,000 plus, minus 200,000, which is the discount. This is the purchase price, right? And what else should be added to this? Just the cost of initial testing, and that is 20,000. And that's it. 1320. As simple as that. So that was your question from your book. And now I have also designed a question for you guys, which is a bit tricky. So let's try that out. You can wait for 5 minutes, maybe just go and have a cup of water, a cup of tea or water, come back, and we'll start after 5 minutes so that you may get a little bit more refreshed to absorb the more difficult question. Okay, guys, we are back, and let's start with the new question that we were talking about. Okay, Stark Limited purchased an online game on 31st March 2020 to sell on Google Play Store, right? Uh, just purchase a game, and it intends to sell that game to millions of customers on the Google Play Store. And the company has no idea whether the game will be sold on this or not. So the company does not have a good idea of whether the game would be sold or not, but it has purchased it, and it wants to recognize it as an intangible asset. Purchase price of the game was 1,500,000. Trade discount was 100,000. Payment is to be made on 31st March 2022. See, the purchase was made on 2020, and the payment has to be made on 2022. So there's a difference of 2 years between the purchase and the payment. So we'll talk about it, and it must include what? The financing component. Okay, the game had to be improved. You can assume that there were certain errors in the game, and those errors had to be removed. So the game had to improve to bring it to the condition intended by the management, right? For this purpose, the company outsourced the development task to Afraj Chaiwala, which is a local game development team. Uh, The details of this agreement was signed on 31st March 2020 are as under, which means on the date of purchase of the asset, the agreement was signed. Now, what the agreement is saying, under the contract, it would take them 7 months to develop the game, which means the game would be developed by 31st October 2020. Monthly payments of 10,000 were made, which means 70,000. To make the above payments, he obtained a specific loan from bank at an interest of 5% per annum. Now they are also obtaining a loan from the bank to pay for the enhancement, to pay for the for bringing the asset to the condition and location intended for the use. And finally, the deal was negotiated in 3 meetings hosted by Stark Limited. Entertainment expenses on each meeting were rupees 7,000, which means to negotiate that agreement, they incurred 7,000 three times, which is 28,000 rupees. Now, should the software be capitalized? And if not, state your reasons, and if yes, prepare the journal entries. So I'll simply talk about in principle how this question should be approached, and then I will give you guys the time to solve it yourself. And the next class, inshallah, we'll discuss about the solution. Uh, Firstly, the purchase price is the outright purchase price of a separately acquired intangible asset, and this should be recognized. Trade discount should be reduced, right? Now, there's a difference between the payment date and the date of the receipt of the asset. So this should be computed by present valuing it. I did not tell you the discount rate. Let's consider the discount rate to be 10%. Keep it simple, right? Okay. Now, now there are 7 months for game development, and there are 7 installments of 10,000 each, which means 70,000 rupees. And we would assume that this is a qualifying asset, which means this would take a considerably long amount of time to be completed in accordance with IAS 23. I'm not here teaching IAS 23, but you might have learned it in your previous sessions. So that is a qualifying asset. If you can tackle it, you can do it. Otherwise, I'll tell you how to do it in the later videos. So this is a qualifying asset, and you have to work out the exact details. And the loan was obtained at 5% per annum. Remember that. So the borrowing cost should be added to the cost of the software. Remember that. The deal was negotiated in 3 meetings hosted by Stark Limited. Entertainment expenses on each meeting were 7,000. Now these 7,000 rupees were not directly attributable expenses. I want to tell you that very clearly. No, rather they are incidental expenses. Now, what's the difference between directly attributable expenses and incidental expenses? Directly attributable expenses are those which are necessary to bring the asset to the condition intended to be used, right? But incidental expenses are such that they are not necessary, but they may be incurred during the process of bringing the asset to the condition. So because these meetings are incidental, they should not be capitalized, right? So I've given you all the hints about that question. That was a tricky question. That is the kind of question that might be asked in ICAP as well, because it includes financing component at 2 levels. At one point it's being excluded, and at another point it's being included. So this is tricky, but try to solve yourself completely and see what happens. I think it's enough for today's class. It was simple, and we did a lot of questions, probably 9 or 10 questions. So in the next class, before the next class, we will again release some conceptual videos, and then we'll integrate them into a whole live class, right? Just like today. If there are any questions, any feedback, do tell me. Feel free to respond, and then inshallah we'll update our own class schedules accordingly. If you want classes to be held in the morning or in the evening, do give me feedback so that we can actually get along in a better way. Okay guys, take care. Allah Hafiz.